Hello and welcome. We are starting with module 7 today. Till now we have looked at the first language acquisition, looking through various kinds of modalities with respect to phonology, morphology, syntax and so on. So, now we will look at how does the system go as far as second language acquisition is concerned. So, after one child has learned the first language, after the native language is in place and any language that follows, whether we have the same kind of system or whether there is a difference, or overall how does second language acquisition go is what we will be covering in this module as well as in the next module. So, both module 7 and module 8 will be dedicated to second language acquisition, or as we call it in short SLA. So, let us start with the roadmap for this module. In this module, we will start with a brief introduction about what is SLA. What does it mean, what does second language acquisition mean, and then we will also look at a little bit about the early approaches to second language acquisition, second language learning as well as bilingualism and how it impacted the research. So, initially how things went and what are the historically what are the important changes that has happened in this field, that will be covered in the first lecture. Lecture 2 will have a very brief brief overview about the similarities and differences between first and second language acquisition. Of course, the differences are many, but we will, because here in this module the focus will be completely on SLA, but just to give you a brief overview as to how what are the main differences that the literature talks about. So, we will look at it in the second lecture. Lecture 3 will look at the theoretical approaches. Some of the theories you are already familiar with. We have talked about nativism at great length and constructivism. We will also look at how very different kinds of theories have been proposed for second language acquisition as well. So, we will start with universal grammar and then in the lecture 4 we will follow it up with the functional approaches. So, different kinds of approaches starting with universal grammar and then functional, and the last lecture we will look at the psychological and neural aspects of SLA. This is today as things stand today in the more recent past, let us say. So, starting with in the next lecture 2 onward we will start to look at the various approaches and so on, but today we will start with the history, and this particular module will end with the latest research. So, latest research focuses more on the psychological and the neural aspects, cognitive aspects of SLA. That is how we will have a holistic understanding of how the field has changed and everything in between. Of course, there are many other theories, a little bit of it also will be discussed in terms of complexity theory and learner differences and so on. So, let us start with lecture 1 today. As I said, lecture 1 we will look at what is SLA and we will also trace the history. So, what is SLA? As in we will look at the basic premises of what second language acquisition studies basically refer to. What are the primary tenets, what are the primary issues and what are the points of departure for this. So, first thing first, how to define SLA. So, there is a very different definition of SLA is quite flexible. So, primarily second language acquisition refers to the study of the processes of acquisition of an additional language after the first language has been already learned. So, any language following the first language is second language. So much so that sometimes many textbooks refer to the third, fourth, fifth language also as second language. So, the term second language is not exactly in terms of the the placeholder kind of thing, is not a second in some terms of very strictly second, but anything that follows the first language, that is follows the native language. So, if my language mother tongue is L1, anything that comes after that can be called L2. Of course, now we are also using L3, L4, but for a general purpose we can refer to all of them as second language acquisition, and for this course we will not be looking at L3, L4 in that sense. We will be primarily looking at languages learnt after the first language. So, both the individuals and the processes may be studied, both the individuals as in how the from a learner centric perspective as well as the processing aspect, both are studied within this and both can be called SLA, that is second language acquisition. Though the concern seems primarily linguistic, as in how the language structure changes, what are the kinds of parameters that are probably constant across different languages and so on. This phenomenon however, has been studied from a multiple disciplinary backgrounds. So, linguistics and psychology of course, are the most notable of them, but sociology also has taken interest in that, and within psychology, social psychology as well as various other kinds of fields have looked at it. So, the idea, even though we are talking about second language acquisition, so it is primarily a language issue, but it can be understood, it can be seen from various perspectives, because as we will slowly see, because learning another language is not just a matter of being able to speak in another language, it has very important repercussions and also very important interactions with many other mental faculties. That is why it is important. So, while linguistics, most of the linguistics related fields, they focus on the structures of the first and the second language, because you want to compare and contrast as to how the structures are either similar or they are different. So, linguistic studies primarily will focus on the structures, on the surface structure, morphology and phonology or syntax or like that. So, the similarities and differences and socio-linguistic factors and their results and so on. Socio-linguistic factors as in what are the conducive conditions for learning a second language, and what happens when it is not there, or various other, it is very nuanced discipline, but this is roughly what socio-linguistic factors refer to, because certain societies may be more open about being bilingual, certain societies may not be, and even when the society is open to being bilingual or multilingual, the languages, the second language, what is your L2 or L3 or for that matter L1 might be under scrutiny under various circumstances. We will look at it slowly, but those are different domains. And when we are talking about psychological perspective of looking at SLA, we are primarily looking at the underlying structure, not the surface structure, that is the linguistic structure, we are looking at the mental structure. Okay, so, the cognitive processes and psychological processes, psychological, mental, cognitive, all these different kinds of processes that are involved in acquisition, that is what psychology studies. And the representation of this knowledge in the human brain, accessing, retrieving that knowledge. So, access, lexical access for example, is studied widely in terms of bilinguals, how bilinguals do that. And how as your language acquisition goes through stages, as you become more and more proficient, whether the accessibility becomes easier and why is it so, and all those things will be typically studied on the psychological perspective, and of course, the interrelationship between second language acquisition and various other mental functions. So, primarily the entire enterprise of psychological perspective is based on the mental functions rather than the language structure per se. So, why do you do what you do and how do you do what you do? So, that is the idea. So, what is a second language? As I said, technically any language learned after the first language is second language, as a result of which it is quite common to see various all the languages after L1 clubbed together as L2, even though they might be in reality they might be third or fourth language. Now, so far we have discussed first language acquisition. So, this is the language that the child learns first, learns or acquires or manifests, whatever you call, depending on the theoretical position you take, but the first language acquisition is something that is used, that is learned, acquired within the ambient environment. So, it is something that the child is born into, something that is already there, right. So, it is primarily untutored and informal. Why is it informal? Because simply speaking, if the child is born, we have already discussed in detail how the child, when they are born, they already have the basic phonological understanding of their own language. So, this is how early their language acquisition actually starts. So, it is untutored, nobody is teaching them consciously. So, this is not a classroom situation where first language acquisition happens. So, from that perspective it is called untutored and it is informal, it is not learnt in a formal scenario. So, this is somebody is simply born into a language. However, the second language when it comes in, there is a slight difference. Second language acquisition often is voluntary. You have to make some effort to learn another language. It might be formal, it can be social. So, in India it is very common for people to pick up multiple languages without really learning them in a formal setup. So, you might be for example, you might be living in Bangalore and you might be basically a Kannada speaker, but you might also be speaking Tamil and Hindi, English and a bit of Telugu and whatever. So, depending on the kind of social environment that you are in, you might just what is in lay terms what is called picking up the language. So, that picking up language is called the social aspect of learning, socially learned language. These are not tutored. On the other hand, English in most of the cases you will be learning English in the school. So, when the child goes to school, they start with alphabets and then simple grammar and so on. So, that is the formal aspect of learning language. So, either of the cases will be considered second language acquisition if it happens after the first language is learned. So, there are two kinds of things, but either way, whichever way you go, there is an amount of voluntary effort there. You have to put some effort to learn, you have to put some effort to notice what is happening. And of course, there will be slight difference between if it is a child learning the second language versus an adult learning a second language. Either way, there will still be some amount of a goal. So, you want to speak that language, but the child when they are born, they are not having an agenda of learning the language that my parents speak. So, that is one of the crucial differences. Now, it is not only just learning another language, but of late a lot of studies have taken place with respect to whether it has any other impact. Fine, you speak another language, it helps you in many practical ways. So, if you are in a multilingual country like India, learning many languages will be beneficial. So, you are going to a different state, knowing the language of that state is beneficial, it is practical to learn that, so that you get by. You understand the local customs and so on. That is one, that is on the pragmatic social side. But on the other side, there are many other factors, many other let us call it important factors which are cognitive in nature, that also has been studied of late as to how learning a second language or more than two languages actually has a direct impact on the way your brain functions. So, that is so it has many repercussions, learning more than one language has multiple repercussions. So, as a result of which there are various kinds of studies from multiple perspectives, and these factors. So, depending on the kind of factors, kind of impact you will have, also will have a lot of interaction with various non-linguistic factors, not just the factor of learning another language, mastering it, having high proficiency or low proficiency, those things are linguistic factors, but non-linguistic factors like age, like socio-cultural background, economic factors and so on and so forth. So, there are multiple things attached to learning another language beyond the first language. What makes you learn another language? That is also a very important question to answer. So, what makes you learn a second language might be the answer to this question might be various. So, often what happens, there is a difference between majority and minority language. So, there is again India is a very good example for that. In India, the states are divided on linguistic lines. So, each state had a language. So, Bengal has Bangla and Assam has Assamese and Odisha has Odia and so on. So, every state has a official language. Now, The complexity arises when you realize that within each state there are multiple groups, multiple languages represented within each state. So, one language is given the status of an official language, state official language. So, in that case the speakers of other languages within that state will automatically need to learn the majority language. So, that is one scenario where you have to learn. So, all the non-Assamese speakers in Assam for example, or all the you take any state, so you take Tamil. So, all non-Tamilians in Tamil need to learn Tamil because that is the official language, something of that sort. So, that is one of the one of the most important reasons. So, as a result of which minority speakers, minority language speakers in any state will be bilingual, automatically bilingual, because the official language has to be learned, that is one. Secondly, the language for education and employment, that is where English comes in Indian scenario. So, English is the language of education, it is also the language of employment. If you need to find job in a slightly broader perspective, at a higher level, or you want to go for higher education, either way English is indispensable in a country like India. So, that is another important reason. Dominant language in social terms, it may or may not have an official status, but in a given social setup, there might be a dominant and dominated language hierarchy. It is always there. Wherever there are multiple languages, there is always a hierarchy. So, even in absence of official status, there will be social status granted to various languages, right. In that case also you may learn. Last but not the least, because it is simply there. So, you are born in a multicultural setup, you live in a society where there are multiple languages spoken around you, you will automatically, this is human nature, you will learn to socially learn certain languages. This is very true in cases where various kinds of campuses around the country, where you have people from different parts of the country. So, everybody uses their own language, and the children typically when they play with children of other groups, they all learn each other's language. So, that is another. So, simply because another language or more than 1, 2 or 3, 4 languages in your environment, you simply learn. This is more true of some countries and less for some other countries, but these are various reasons why people do learn a second language. A connected and often studied together phenomenon is the idea of foreign language. So, but there are slight differences in terms of second and foreign language. So, the foreign language is something that is foreign in origin. So, it is not spoken in your, it is not your own country's language, it's come from somewhere else, typically due to colonialism. So, in English in India is the colonial legacy. So, it has been left behind. It used to be considered a foreign language. Now, of course, we do not consider it foreign language, we have made it our own. And there is a lot of debate about whether you should call it foreign language or second language, but foreign language typically, without getting into the debate, foreign language is a language that is not part of your immediate environment, it has come from somewhere else. So, as a result of which chances of picking up, that is socially learning a foreign language, is next to 0. So, it is very minimal chances are there that you will pick up a foreign language in the environment. Of course, today the situation is different, you do not even need to go into the environment, so to say. You can sit at your home and learn another foreign language through YouTube, but even then the fact remains that this is a different language coming from a different country. It is typically, when it is formally taught, it is taught in a classroom setting, whether it is a virtual classroom or it is a physical classroom it is. So, there is a formal aspect to teaching. So, there is a teaching aspect of learning foreign language. There might be many issues, many reasons why you learn. Often you want to go abroad for studies. So, you want to go to whichever country you want to go to. Nowadays, it is a good idea to learn the language, because you will need to use it as soon as you reach there. Many Western European countries prefer you speaking their language rather than speaking in English. So, you might want to learn German before going to Germany. That could be one of the most important reasons as to why people learn foreign language. Sometimes people might have special interest. while studying in school or college or just like that, you might want to learn another foreign language, you just learn. So, there are various this kind of situations. So, there are differences between the motivating factors between second and a foreign language as well as the way they are learned. Second language may be learned socially, but foreign language typically no. Now, there are various factors, as I stated in the beginning also, that there are multiple perspectives from which second language acquisition has been studied and is being studied. Some of these I have noted here. So, the learners, so learner centric perspective, learner centric issues, though what are those factors that are primarily learner centric? For example, it could be motivation, it could be age, it could be attitude, n number of things are there with respect to the learner. So, those are factors, that is one big chunk of factors with respect to studying SLA as a discipline. Similarly, the first language, what is the first language of the learner, that is also important. Why is it important? Because we will see soon that there are various theories about how your first language might impact your second language. So, what is the first language? Is it similar to your second language or is it very different? So, for example, if your first language has a very different sound system as opposed to the second language, there might be some amount of time needed to adjust, to calibrate, so to say. So, if your mother tongue does not have certain sounds that the second language has, there will be a period of adjusting. So, this is why first language is important, whatever is the first language of the learner, the given language. And this will change if you are learning English as a second language versus you are learning Hindi as a second language in India, there will be differences, right. So, those kind of things. Environment, of course, the ambient languages that are there, and depending on that also you might have. So, what are the languages in the environment, what kind of hierarchy are in place, and that takes us to the socio-cultural practices and attitudes also. For example, many authors, many scholars have pointed out that in having a Spanish accent in New York English, if you are speaking in English in US in New York and you have a Hispanic accent, Spanish accent versus you have a French accent, the attitude of the people might be different, right. So, even if both are bilinguals, both of them are using English as a second language, both of them have accent, but because of the language which is their first language, the attitudes will be different. So, this is another aspect that has been studied a lot. Learning method also comes into play, whether it is socially learned or it is formally learned, classroom teaching or peer group sort of acquisition, that is also important. Goal is why you learn. So, various, these are just some of the features, but there are many more. These are the important features that have been already studied in this domain. So, and not only these are different factors on their own, but often they interact, because human societies are such that there are multiple things at play all the time. So, there are interactions of these things also give rise to quite an interesting, makes this entire field very interesting. Now, when we say bilingualism or second language acquisition, we kind of take it for granted that in today's world almost everybody is bilingual. However, that is not uniformly so. Some languages, some countries have are typically bilingual, some countries are more prone towards being bilingual, some countries are very less bilingual. So, for example, in UK or Iceland, this kind of countries have very little incentive or very little reason for being a bilingual. So, for them to learn a second language, and hence you will see the research literature will typically tell you that these countries people have, it is less common for people to acquire a second language. On the other hand, for example, in many countries like Asia or Africa, it is these countries are predominantly multilingual, not just because we have foreign languages coming in here, but we are ourselves quite a rich rich country with in terms of languages, cultures and so on. So, we have multiple languages here and people learn. So, this is more common than being a monolingual. In India, finding a monolingual is more difficult than finding a bilingual or multilingual. So, there are variations across people, across nations. Similarly, the setting might impact the way we learn a second language. For example, a Punjabi learning English in UK or Canada has a very different purpose If you know the Punjabis in Canada, you will understand what I am getting at. So, there is a different purpose when you are in a different country, you have a particular goal towards learning the local language, and there are particular domains of the targeted use and so on. That is one kind of motivation, one kind of set scenario. As compared to, let us say, a Bengali in India learning Taiwanese for academic interest. So, there are these disparate examples are given in order to make you understand how different the simple act of learning a second language can be, depending on where you are, who you are, why you learn, what you learn, and so on. So, all of these will impact as to what is learnt and how it is learned. Me learning Taiwanese, for example, in sitting here may have completely different output as opposed to if I have to, if I am out there in a different country trying to learn their language. Similarly, age is a very important factor. When we study this second language acquisition, there is majority of literature is focused on the child bilingual versus adult bilingual differences and similarities. So, is it the same when a child learns another language and an adult learns another language? What are the similarities, what are the differences, why are they so? Various things. So, there are many other different kinds of research that has been undertaken in this domain. So, as a result of which, within the learner centric perspectives, within the learner centric factors, age remains one of the most important, most crucial topics, and also the most debated as well. So, as a result of which we have childhood and adult bilingualism, but that is not where the story ends. Even within childhood bilingual group, there are differences depending on when in childhood the child is learning the second language. So, for example, if they learn the second language very early, they might be not technically part of the SLA group. SLA will be when the child is learning the second language slightly later, let us say after 3 years. So, if they learn another language before 3 years, they will not be called the second language as such. So, there are differences even there. So, we will be discussing all of these. So, in the nutshell, second language acquisition has been studied from multiple perspectives, social, psychological, neural, etc., across population, across age group with varying L1 and so on. Now, let us look at some of the background information before we. So, till now I was introducing the idea of SLA to you. Now, let us look at how it came into being, how did it all start and how smooth the journey has been. So, this was not always a very fashionable domain to study. In fact, it was not even popular, it was not even a good idea to study bilingualism. Back in 1920s, there were studies primarily from the perspective of education and policy level analysis, and the focus was on the immigrant children in North American schools. And what was noticed is that immigrant children in North American schools were less successful than their monolingual peers. So, bilingual children in North American schools were doing poorly as opposed to the monolingual, that is English speaking local children, local English speaking children. So, they were not doing very well. So, that triggered a lot of research, lot of studies, and one of the easy explanation that was given was that all these children, immigrant children, they were all bilinguals. They were speaking Spanish at home and English in school. So, as a result of which they were not able to cope up. So, readily there was an explanation that bilingualism was the problem. Why it should be so, that was not at that time, it was not studied. So, for quite some time bilingualism remained a very in a very negative light because of this kind of formulations, this kind of assumptions. Because these children were cognitive. So, there were tasks on their cognitive abilities, and it was found out that they were not, their IQ level or their cognitive abilities were not at par with the with the monolinguals. The idea was because they are bilingual, their cognitive abilities have not been developed properly. So, as a result of which bilingualism was considered a disorder at that time. It remained for quite some time, and so once there is a disorder, you need to treat. How did they decide to treat it? treating was done in terms of ruthless instruction in majority language, eradicating the invading language. So, the first language, which was the home language, was considered the invading language, which was causing trouble for the children to speak in English, as a result of which they must stop using that language. So, they were not like in today's schools, in many schools we have children are discouraged from speaking their mother tongue, they should speak only in English. This was done in a much more in a much worse way in this particular scenario. So, there was a very no nonsense kind of instruction in majority language in order to stop them from speaking their mother tongue. Now, this was this is all the way back in early 1900s. There were some exceptions as well, because around the same time 1939 to 1949 was the very famous study on Leopold's child, who was growing up, the daughter, his own daughter was growing up as a simultaneous bilingual, and he studied her language acquisition stages and narrated all of them, discussed all of them, but that was this kind of studies were exceptions, but because they were there, we must keep that in mind as well. Now, a change in perspective towards bilingualism happened in the 1970s, something from a very unlikely place it came. Why did it happen? It happened in Canada. In Canada, you have, all of you must be already aware, there are Anglophones and there are Francophones. So, in the Anglophone Canadian children at that time, they had to undergo immersion program in French. So, they had to learn their entire most of the time almost entirely, sometimes partly, the education was done through French. Even if their mother tongue was English, they used English at home. But in this case, among these children, the bilingual pathology, which means their inability to do well in cognitive tasks, was not found. Hence, it became kind of clear that bilingualism should not be the one to be blamed for the problem here, and as a result of which this entire scenario brought bilingualism out of the darkness and into the mainstream of research. Simultaneously, there were many other things that were happening in 1970s. So, there was we also saw emergence of multiple perspectives on language processing and acquisition taking place at the same time. So, from linguistic, psycholinguistic, sociolinguistic and neurolinguistic approaches were also becoming very prominent at that time. Educational perspectives were still around, but often what happened was educational perspective was taken after the data from these different domains came in. So, it was a secondary study rather than a primary study, because now in the 70s there was many new things started actually in the 70s, psycholinguistics is one of them. So, a lot of new angles were brought in. So, within linguistics there were many domains, of course, we will get back to it when we talk about theories, but just to give you a brief idea. Within linguistics, applied linguistics was one domain that looked at second language acquisition quite thoroughly through contrastive analysis and transfer theory, and similarly through creative construction hypothesis and of course, language acquisition device. So, contrastive analysis primarily looked at the difference between L1 and L2 as to if there are differences, then what are those domains that the child will find difficult to understand, to navigate. That was the basic idea with contrastive analysis. So, second language learning was explained through transfer, like the ideas or the structure in L1 will be transferred to L2, and when there is a difference between these two languages, there are problems. Similarly, there was another theory that replaced transfer theory, was creative construction theory by around mid 1970s. This one said that one learns a second language by using the same processes that they used for first language acquisition all over again. So, it is not like because L1 is already in place, you just map the structure of L1 on L2 and thereby you have mistakes, you have errors. So, contrastive analysis was based on largely on the errors that you make. On the other hand, creative construction said a completely different thing, and of course, the most popular account of second language acquisition, again we have to go back to Chomsky. His idea, he believed that we learn language by setting principles and parameters on the language acquisition device, which we have discussed before as well. Therefore, second language acquisition involves resetting some of these parameters. So, these are some of the theories within the linguistic or applied linguistic domain. Sociolinguistic domain on the other hand started looking at various kinds of contextual facts for learning second language. For example, the status of the languages, whether it is low status versus high status, what kind of hierarchy exists in the society between the L1 and L2, and also different kinds of bilingualism that you might have as a result, additive, subtractive. So, do you add one language to another, or on the or whether when you are learning a second language, it will replace the mother tongue. So, that is subtractive. So, these are areas that sociolinguistic aspects of bilingualism or learning a second language looked at. Psycholinguistic perspective on the other hand looked at a very different domain. For example, the psychological processes that are responsible for language in use. So, when we are looking at psycholinguistics, it will be primarily focused on the processes, mental processes, not on the language per se, nor in the social domain. It is in the internal mental domain where the focus is. So, the variables to study here will be aptitude, motivation, form of instruction, so on and so forth. So, these were the initial processes looked at from the psycholinguistic perspective. And then apart from a broader shift from the looking at bilingualism as a disorder to looking at it for its own sake, there were other things that also was happening within linguistics, within the field of language research itself. So, these also have had direct implication for the second language acquisition research. For one, bilingualism itself became mainstream. It was not comparing bilingualism with monolingualism as some sort of an afterthought was changed around this time in the 70s, mid 70s onwards, where bilingualism was beginning to be studied for its own sake. Bilingualism itself is an important and a standalone sort of a thing that could be seen. So, the more important problem that they thought was to be solved was first language. Initially it was first language acquisition, but then later on the focus shifted from first to second language acquisition. Also, there was a shift in terms of the psycholinguistic research from product to the processes, because as I said, psycholinguistics focuses on the process, but in the 50s till 50s we had behaviorism, which was looking at the product, what is it that is visible. And there was a shift after Chomsky coming in and cognitive revolution and all that happened, and then the focus shifted from the product to the processes. So, the underlying process rather than the visible output, visible behavioral output. So, language acquisition among children was increasingly seen as a co-developing phenomenon, co-developing ability alongside their intellectual development. So, children's development was understood in terms of them developing schemas, going back to Piaget and others. So, children develop, they have their stages of development starting with early childhood, when you have sensory motor stage, when they develop the schemas of the experiences and so on. So, this is as a result of various kinds of experiences, specific experiences, and as they grow, these schemas are elaborated and restructured. Now, where does language come in place? So, the critical aspect of this theory is that children's experiences determined important aspects of cognitive organization, and which in turn will be affecting their intellectual achievement. Now, because bilingualism is also a kind of an experience, it is also another skill that you are learning, that is where bilingualism got highlighted in the psycholinguistic or psychological schema of things, because children are creating schema, using them and elaborating them, thereby having the different kinds of cognitive and intellectual achievements. So, as a result of which bilingualism was looked at from this perspective as well. So, this is how the inquiry into the second language acquisition was shaped in the initial decade. So, that is where we complete with the historical aspect of this, and this is where you also come to the end of the lecture 1. Lecture 2 we will start looking at other aspects. Thank you.